Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me back again today. I'm excited to be speaking to our next guest. He is Shankar Vedantam, who is the author of a fascinating book called The Hidden Brain, and he's a host of a podcast of the same name. Now, many of you might have already met Shankar already because The Hidden Brain is one of the most popular podcasts in the world. He has over 2 million downloads per week, 2 million. The focus of his podcast and his book is on human behavior and the social sciences and really helping us understand how the human brain works and how it applies to our everyday lives and things that we experience. I'm geeking out right now. Welcome to the show, Shankar. I'm so excited about our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Diego. I'm really excited about the conversation too.
Awesome. Now, we're having you on because the idea of working with robots, working with automation, comes with some psychological considerations and cognitive implications, that tie back to, just how humans think about work and their place in society and the world. And these are really important subjects that we as a company want to help lead the conversation with in the world. So we thought it'd be great to have you on here to talk about just sort of the brain and how the brain thinks about work, and we'll think about work in the future. So excited to get started. Have some questions for you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So UiPath is very at the core of what we enlist and enable in our customers' companies is this massive change that is centered around the future of work, right? Now, when you have this level of change, people can often be initially resistant to new technologies that are causing the change. They have worries, right? They're concerned. What does psychology tell us about our willingness to engage with change?
Yeah, it's a great question, Diego, because in some ways, humans are incredibly adaptable. We are a species that in some ways is marked by adaptability. We sort of live in different parts of the world and we adapt to different climates. We're very adaptable. But as a general rule, we're also resistant to change. It's a paradox, which is that we like the true and tested. We like to stick with the comfortable. We don't like to sort of venture out into the unknown. And it's often because the unknown carries risks. Many years ago, there was a very interesting experiment that was conducted at Stanford University. You've probably heard about this. It's called the marshmallow test. And I mentioned the marshmallow test because when you think about change, all change involves fundamentally the same trade-off. The change is basically saying, do something that in the present might be difficult. In the present, it might involve learning something new. But in the long term, it's going to pay off. In other words, you pay a short-term cost, you get a long-term benefit. That's the underlying psychological trade-off of all change. And the marshmallow test, which, as I said, was devised at Stanford University by Walter Mischel 50 years ago, explored that same idea. Walter Mischel brought very young children into a laboratory. He basically said, he sat them in front of a table, and he put them a marshmallow in front of the table, in front of them. And he said, if you can sit in this room with this marshmallow for 5 minutes and not eat this, if you can sit in the room for 5 minutes and not eat the marshmallow, you can then have 2 marshmallows. And the idea was the researchers would leave the room, and then for 5 minutes, the kid would try and struggle with self-control to keep himself or herself from eating the marshmallow. And what Walter Mischel found eventually was that people who are very good at delaying gratification, as he called it, had significant life success later on. They were more likely to graduate college, more likely to do well in their careers, more likely to get married, stay married. It had all kinds of benefits. Now, a few years ago, researchers at the University of Rochester reran the marshmallow test, but they did it with a twist. And what they found was very interesting, and I think speaks directly to the question that you're asking me. So they reran the marshmallow test. Again, they brought kids in, sat them in a room, put a marshmallow before them, and said, if you wait for 5 minutes, you can get 2. The adult leaves the room and then comes back after 5 minutes, and here's the twist. The adult tells the kid, I'm sorry, but there isn't a second marshmallow. There wasn't a second marshmallow in the other room. You can still have the 1 marshmallow that you have, but there isn't going to be a bonus for having waited for 5 minutes. Here's the question. When you play the marshmallow test again with this kid, and you tell the kid, wait for 5 minutes, and there's going to be a second marshmallow, what is the kid going to tell you? The kid's going to say, forget about it. I've played this game before. I know how this game ends. I'm not interested in playing the game. And so part of what actually it turns out the marshmallow test is measuring is not just our innate ability to delay gratification or do the difficult thing. It's also measuring in some ways the stability of the worlds in which we live. I do live in a world where if you do good things happen to you. You do bad things happen to you. Or do you live in an unpredictable world where you do good things and bad things can happen to you. When you look at the people who are often resistant to change in organizations and workplaces, it's easy for us often to imagine that these are just people who are, obstinate or stubborn or unwilling to change. But really what you're often finding in many of these cases is the people who are resistant to change are resistant partly because they have been burned before. They have been told, do the difficult thing now, it's going to pay off in the future. And they did the difficult thing and it didn't pay off in the future. And now when you come back and ask them, do the difficult thing again, they say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm resistant to change. So part of, in some ways, the challenge of change is really a challenge of trust, which is that if you don't actually have trust with the people whom you're trying to change, changing people is extraordinarily difficult.
That really ties in well to what we see in practical experience with those who have become successful with automation, because typically what they do is they will, it's too much for people based on the way humans react to overwhelm them with too much change at one time often, right? So what we see in the customers who are doing the most is that they roll out automation in stages. And they get people used to working with robots. And the more hands-on they could be with software robots, the better the organization actually does in adapting and becoming more successful with automations, because people start to get comfortable, they start to get used to it, and then they actually start to want more, actually. So they'll see that, hey, they gave me this robot, what it ended up doing it didn't take my job away. What it ended up doing was getting rid of 30 minutes of paperwork I was doing every day. And I still have my job and it's actually a little bit better. Give me more, right? We actually call this the automation flywheel, because the more people start using them, the more they want, and they actually start suggesting and even building their own automation. Does that align with the way you think about change?
It does. And when you think about it, this is the way that trust operates in general, right? Trust is something that is built up over time. And once you actually have a relationship of trust, getting something moving is getting it started is the hard part. But once you've actually gotten it started, you don't need very much more to keep it going. And that speaks very much to the issue of the flywheel. The other thing that's worth noting here is a very powerful force in human nature, and that's the power of inertia. So when we think about how most of us do most things, we imagine that we're doing things because we've deliberately thought about them, we've deliberately chosen to do option A or option B. In reality, however, most of the time, what we are actually choosing is what we've been doing already. There was an interesting experiment that was conducted many years ago, I think this was in California, where researchers went up to people, I think these were people who had signed up for a utility service. And there were two kinds of utilities that were available. There was a more reliable version of the utility service and a less reliable version. The more reliable version cost a little bit more. The less reliable version cost a little bit less. So they went to people who had the more reliable service and they said, would you want to pay a little less money in exchange for getting a little less reliability? Would you be willing to trade down from what you had? And most people said, no, we're happy to stay exactly where we are. And if you just stop there, you would get the impression that people really cared about reliability more than anything else. But the researchers went to the other group. This is the group that had less reliable electricity at a lower price and said, would you like a little more reliability? You'd have to pay a little bit more for it, but would you like a little more reliability? And those people also said, no, I'm just fine exactly staying where I am. And really the message from both those things tells you that where people are is where people stay. And that has an enormous implication for change, because of course what that means is that when change has come to an organization, getting it started is difficult because you're fighting not just trust issues, but you're fighting inertia. But it also means once you get change started, once you get that flywheel turning, the inertia now starts to work in your favor rather than against you.
Yeah, that's exactly what we see. We find a way to get people, even in simple ways, get them started, and then they actually start to come along. Overcoming that inertia, it's exactly what we see.
And Dave, you're actually raising a really important point, which is that when you start, it really is important to start small, because it's really important to actually get early victories. In other words, rather than trying to roll out what would be the ideal version of the change on day one, Much more important is to get change that works for everyone, that everyone's going to be happy with, and build from there. And this is exactly the way trust works. So if two people are exploring whether they want to get married to each other, they don't start the first day by proposing to each other. You start the first day by having lunch, and then you have dinner, and then you do one thing more, and then one thing more, and it builds from there. So starting small and making sure the initial steps are well received and people are happy is really essential to this process of starting, the trust flywheel, or the inertia flywheel, or the automation flywheel, as you call it.
Yeah, it's the number one piece of advice I give. For everyone watching today, if you're going to take away anything, take away that. Get started small and really get that flywheel going. And thank you for giving us some science behind why that actually works. Next time I recommend it, I'll actually be able to explain why it works. A lot of this is when we go and explain the benefit of why automation is useful to you. It helps you overcome the tedious and the boring part of your job. This is what's true in practice, and the way we present it to the workers inside the companies that ultimately end up working with automation. It would seem evident that people don't want to do boring jobs, but you have evidence. You've shown us evidence that people sometimes underestimate the negative effects of boring work. What are some of those effects, and why do they underestimate it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think all of us have had the experience of being bored, and all of us know that being bored is not fun. So when you're sitting on a very monotonous, train journey or plane journey, or, nothing much is happening, or many of us are experiencing this during quarantine, during the COVID pandemic, the days feel like they're blurring into one another because each day feels exactly like the previous day. We're not going out, we're not hanging out with friends, we're not traveling, we're not doing those things. And it's very monotonous, it can get very boring. And all of us understand that this can be very aversive. Paradoxically, though, when you give people choices, people don't always choose to do things that are less boring. And this is a really fascinating thing. Peter Ubel at Duke University, he once ran this experiment where he offered people the choice. He said, I will pay you a small amount of money to either do nothing, or you can solve these really tricky and difficult puzzles. And people said, okay, the choice is I'm going to get a certain amount of money, say $5, $10. I can either sit in a room for 10 minutes and do absolutely nothing and I get paid $10, or I can try and do these puzzles for 10 minutes and I get paid $10. And what Ubel found is that significant numbers of people preferred the choice of doing nothing, because the model that we have in our heads is that if you can get paid for doing nothing, that's supposed to be a good job. If you can get paid without actually exercising any effort, that's actually a good job. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that when Ubel actually looked at the people in the study, the people who actually chose option A or option B, the people who chose the puzzles, even the people who didn't solve the puzzles, were significantly more satisfied and happy than the people who chose to do nothing, right? Because it was engaging, they thought about it, they had to struggle with it. Some of them got the answer, some of them didn't, but it was engaging. The interesting thing is when we are making that choice prospectively as opposed to retrospectively, when prospectively we're making the choice, many of us fall into this trap of what Peter Ubel calls effort aversion. And the effort aversion trap suggests that basically whatever takes the least amount of effort is the best choice to make. That's not true in much of our life. And in fact, it turns out that actually if you can spend your day doing creative work that might be harder to do than boring, repetitive, mundane work, but the creative work in many ways is going to make you significantly happier. But I think when you're spreading the message of how boredom is pernicious and how we should overcome boredom, I think one of the challenges to overcome in some ways is the inbuilt bias that many of us have of basically assuming that if you can get by doing what you've done before, if you can get by without doing more work, that's always a better option. So psychologically, there is something about the appeal of doing nothing that is appealing to many people. And I think we don't actually foresee actually doing nothing, spending all of your days doing nothing or doing boring work or doing tedious work, repetitive work, really saps you and it takes out so much of what makes life meaningful and work fun.
So Shankar, if the value of creativity has been proven, and we certainly believe it, we actually see the work we're doing as empowering or enabling another revolution in terms of, similar to the Industrial Revolution. And this revolution will free people up, and this is where we see it going, free people up to focus on creative tasks, more value-adding tasks, take the boredom out of their job, and generally be good for companies and workers alike. If that's what this can enable, why are organizations not necessarily thinking about giving people more creative freedom, or why is this not systematically happening across the board, across the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution a second ago, Diego, and I think in some ways that's actually relevant to our conversation here. I think so many of our work practices today are actually informed by the Industrial Revolution and things that were set in place during the Industrial Revolution. So let's just discuss just a couple of them. One of them is this curious notion that when someone comes and works for you, you're paying them by the hour. So in other words, you're paying them not for the work that they're doing, but for the amount of time that they're spending. And that actually, when you think about it, that's sort of an odd way of thinking about what work is, right? So I can come and spend 3 hours at your workplace, but am I actually contributing anything to your workplace? Am I getting anything out of the workplace? Measuring productivity in terms of time, in some ways, is an artifact of how, in the old days, people would punch in time cards when they entered a factory, and they punched out time cards when they left the factory, and you're just measuring how much time people are physically spending in your plan. Increasingly, we've moved to a world that's very different from that, right? Because the amount of time you spend is not really the metric of how productive you are or how valuable you are to a company. It's what have you created? What have you actually brought to the table that's new? How have you actually moved us forward or moved the company forward in some way that's really interesting? And I think this artifact of thinking about time in this way is one of the reasons I think we underestimate, and companies generally underestimate, the risks of boredom and tedium, right? Because when you thinking just in terms of time, you sort of say, all right, someone has worked 6 hours. You're not really counting, has 4 hours, those 6 hours have they spent doing really boring and repetitive work that actually is not very important for my bottom line, not really important for what my company is doing. When you start to devise and think about work, not just in terms of time, but in terms of actually the work itself, now your conception of work actually changes dramatically. And many companies, of course, are doing this. Many companies are increasingly saying, we don't really care how many hours you work. We don't care how much vacation time you take. We don't even care where you are physically when you work. All we care is the outputs of your work. We care about what it is that you're doing, because that's what eventually determines our bottom line. And as more and more companies, I think, move to that model where they're actually focused on outcomes rather than process, I think you're likely to see companies asking the question, what can we do to minimize tedium? And not just from the point of view that this is the right thing to do vis-a-vis the mental health of your workers, although that's a perfectly good reason to do it as well, but just from the point of view of the bottom line, which is that eventually the way forward for almost every company in the world is not merely to keep doing what you have been doing for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The way forward is always to figure out what's next, to figure out what's new, to figure out how to grow. And if you're not unleashing the single biggest resource you have, which is the talent and the creativity of the people who are your workforce, how can you possibly expect to thrive in the next 10, 20, or 30 years?
Absolutely. And if you think about it, we will help companies automate the tedious, automate the mundane, and take that off of the plate of the people doing the work. And we'll often get asked the question, well, what are they going to do with that time? Are they going to go look at social media, spend their time, waste their time?
Yeah.
And I think what you find is it's not so much of that, but you're freeing them and you're giving them the space to think. Right, the switching cost from going from task to task is quite expensive, right? If I have to spend 20 minutes doing this task, it's going to take me another 20 minutes before I can get back to thinking about problems to solve or abstract thought. It takes, from what I've seen, my own personal experience and my reading, it takes the brain some time to get into that deep work state, right? So we're giving them the space to do more deep work, which ultimately is where most of the value is created by humans in the organization.
Yes, there's an old idea in economics, which is if you think about saving $1 that you might have lost or gaining $1 that you do not have, you should think about these $2 equally, right? In other words, if your salary is $100, you should care just as much about your salary not dropping to 99 as you do about your salary going up to 101, because in both cases, it means $1 to you. But it turns out that human beings don't think this way. We are very, very focused on what it is that we have and preserving what we have rather than thinking about the path forward. And I think that speaks to the underlying question that you're really asking, which is I think many companies are so focused on saying, how do we preserve what we have? How do we preserve our current revenue, our current market share, where we are, so we're not losing ground. And that's, of course, an important thing to think about. But I think companies are so focused on that question, they're not asking the more important question, where is the growth? How do we grow? Because if you think about most of us in our personal lives, let alone our professional lives, all of us know that change is inevitable. All of us know that in really who we're going to be in 10 years' time is not who we are today. That's true for companies as well. But in many ways, I think we don't operationalize this and we don't actually focus on if we truly believe that we are going to have to be very different 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we should be investing a lot of time right now in inventing that future, not just letting the future happen to us, but actually inventing that future. I think when you have companies that basically are less focused on the future, they're more focused on the past and preserving what they have, you're more likely to see companies say, how do we protect the status quo? How do we keep doing things the way we've done them before? And companies that are really focused on looking forward are going to be the companies that say, how do we break new ground? How do we free up people so that the 40 hours they're spending at my workplace, instead of spending 20 hours filling out boxes on pieces of paper, they're spending those 20 hours inventing what I'm going to be 10 years from now.
And that brings up another really interesting consideration in that we've been talking so far a lot about removing the tedious and getting rid of the mundane and freeing people to have more time. But there's also an aspect of augmentation here, right? There's also the aspect of what can we do when a robot helps us do our work, not just takes away work. A big part of what we're seeing our customers, exploring right now is, can we use robots as an extension of the worker or as an extension of the mind? I know you've done some work at looking at how we relate to robots and other machines in our lives. What are you seeing along those lines about using technology as extensions of the mind?
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you look at the history of human civilization. What you see over, really tens of thousands of years is that we have become very skilled at finding and devising the tools that allow us to do more than our physical abilities would allow us to do. And we see this all the time, right? So if you build a spear, and now the spear can do something that you can't do in person. The spear can travel 30 feet in a matter of seconds that you can't do in person. And the spear can actually accomplish something that you can't physically do. So human beings are very skilled at building tools that allow us in some ways to augment ourselves. So if you think about the automobile or the plane, these are tools that are designed to augment what it is that we might be able to do on our own. Many of us, however, don't make the same connection when it comes to technology and sort of think about the role that technology is playing in augmenting our own minds. And I think there are philosophers and computer scientists who are starting to think about this very seriously, of asking, just as it would be absurd to imagine that our physical capabilities today are limited to what our hands and feet can do, right? So all of us know our physical capabilities are no longer limited to our hands and feet, because our hands and feet are augmented by all kinds of technologies that allow us to do much more than our hands and feet could do on their own. In exactly the same way, how are technologies in some ways augmenting what our minds can do? And when you think about that, and of course, the truth is that technologies are already augmenting what our minds can do in all kinds of ways. The phone that I'm carrying around, the smartphone that I'm carrying around in my pocket, has so much knowledge and information about the world that's helping me navigate the world much more efficiently and much better than I could do without the phone in my pocket. In some ways, some people would say this is almost literally true. The phone has become an extension of my mind. I almost think of this as being part of my mind. It's an illusion in some ways to think about your brain as limited to the 3 pounds of tissue that are between your ears. At one level, that is your physical brain, of course. But again, thinking about how we use tools, it's really important to start thinking about this idea of the extended mind and the idea that the mind actually transcends what is just inside your skull, because the things that you can do to help your mind move forward, and these can be trivial things, the notepad on which you're making notes, you're doodling an idea for a new project and you're sketching out something very quickly. The sketch helps your mind now go to the next step and say, I can take the sketch and actually go one generation past it. So the sketch in some ways is augmenting your mind. It's helping your mind do more than what your mind can do without the sketch. Technology works in exactly the same way. And in many ways, when we think about technology this way, we're really asking a deep and profound question, which is where do our minds actually begin and where do our minds end? Because when you think about what technology is actually offering our minds today, it's really offering us the possibility of expanding our minds beyond the confines of what we were used to doing. And this is the other reason why it's really vital to spend our minds doing the kinds of things that only our minds can do. There are creative things that our minds can do. There are innovative things that our minds can do that computers and robots cannot do. Maybe one day they can, but right now they cannot do. It's really foolish to take human beings and have human beings do those boring and repetitive tasks, when in some ways you should be turning those over to the machines and liberating humans to do the tasks that only they can do.
Excellent. I mean, yeah, if you think about it, this is just another in a long line of technologies that have emerged, created by humanity to help us,
Yes.
Think better. Just writing, when writing emerged, it enabled us to think of abstract concepts for the first time, right? Like things that we could not capture and stay in our mind.
Exactly.
We're able to record them, and then
Exactly.
publish it, right? The book and the printing press enabled us to expand ideas and imprint mimetically onto the mind new ideas that you never thought of before, right? But now are part of your mind, and this is just a continuation. I definitely agree with you and see it that way. So Shankar, the last question then is, advice for, I'm gonna ask you for advice for UiPath and for everyone who's on this, who is deploying automations and robots. What advice would you give us in terms of how we design our robots and bring them, bring this technology to life?
So I'll give one piece of advice, and that piece of advice, I think, comes down to how we relate to these things that we have created, right? So, for example, it used to be in the old days when your TV set was not sort of producing a clear signal and it had those rabbit ear antennas that we would put at the back of our TV set. All of us, have gone and tapped the side of the TV in order to get a clearer signal, right? So in other words, we do this with computers all the time. The computer freezes up and we get angry and we hit the keyboard, or we sort of, some of us might even punch the computer. The reason we have these, in other words, what I'm pointing out is that as we work with these technological tools that are deeply embedded in our lives, they become so much a part of our lives. As we said, they almost feel like extensions of ourselves, that when these tools in some ways don't work the way we want them to work, we get upset with them in the way that we get upset with other people. So in other words, we get frustrated with our technologies in the same way we get frustrated with people. And of course, at any cognitive level, we know it doesn't make sense to get angry at your computer or your keyboard, because they're inanimate machines. They actually have no feelings. They actually are not relating to you the way that you are relating to them. But human beings are so skilled at sort of finding, we have this idea called theory of mind, which is that one of the things that we're very skilled at doing when we're talking to other people is intuiting what is happening in this other creature's mind. That's how we're able to have conversations with one another. As we're talking, you are reading my mind and I am reading your mind. And this happens subtly and unconsciously with every interaction that we have. Now, it turns out this also happens when we interact with inanimate objects. In some ways, we project agency and intention and values onto these inanimate objects. And when they let us down, we feel that another friend has let us down. We feel that a person has let us down, and we react unfavorably to them. So the advice that I would give in terms of design is not so much that we should anthropomorphize our computers and our robots. I don't think that's the goal. The goal is not to anthropomorphize everything, but the goal is to recognize in many ways that our relationships with technology are in some ways more intimate than just a relationship between me and a machine. That in some ways we're relating to things that actually have become part of our lives, so much so that we come to take them for granted. We come to sort of rely on them as we might rely on a friend. And so as you're building technologies and as we're devising new systems, I think it's really important to keep in mind, what are the rules of interpersonal communication that guide us in our everyday life? So for example, when a machine is basically giving me feedback, when I'm logging into my computer for the first time in the morning and I'm really rushing because I'm late for a Zoom meeting, and my computer suddenly pops up a window saying you have these 3 updates to install. If a friend did this to me, it would be incredibly rude. I'm running to a meeting and a friend basically says, here are 3 updates you have to install before you can run to a meeting, but the computer is not paying attention to it. But in some ways, I think the next generation of technology will pay attention to things like this. It'll actually say, what is the mind state of the person that I can actually present to them things in a state and at a time where they can actually process those things? How do I stage what I'm showing to people so that they can relate to what I'm doing? Because all of us have times in the day when we have a little more bandwidth. When if the computer tells me I have 3 updates to install, I'll say, great, go for it, take the next 10 minutes. And there are other times in the day when the computer says I'm going to have 3 updates to install, when it drives me nuts. So as you're designing technology, I think to pay attention to the psychological dynamics we have with the machines that we have, because in many ways the machines we have are not just machines. I think if there's one takeaway from this conversation we've had over the last half an hour, it really is this intensely personal and intimate relationship that we have with technology. And I think you're in the forefront of working on that relationship.
All right, Shankar, thank you so much for the advice. I know I speak for everyone at UiPath when I say these are the type of issues that we think about. These are the type of things that we think about when we're designing our product, and thinking about how we're leading the next wave of technology, the next technological revolution. These are important topics, and so glad to get to spend the time with you today discussing this in depth. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you,
Diego. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Everyone, once again, his book is called The Hidden Brain. The podcast is called The Hidden Brain. If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, please go out and check those things out. Shankar, once again, thank you. Have a great day. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Diego. It's been a real pleasure.